for much of the 20th century. George Burns was not simply a comedian, but a living chronicle of American entertainment itself. His life spanned vaudeville, radio, film, television, and the modern stand-up era, and his longevity made him appear almost timeless. Yet behind the familiar image of the cigar-smoking elder statesman of comedy was a man shaped early by deprivation, instability, and a relentless need for self-reliance. Understanding this foundation is essential to understanding every major decision he made later in life, including the controversial choice of how he distributed his fortune. Burns was born Nathan Birnbaum in 1896 on New York's Lower East Side, one of the most overcrowded and impoverished immigrant neighborhoods in America. He grew up in a family of 12 children, packed into a small apartment where survival depended on constant improvisation. His father's sudden death, when George was only 8 years old, erased what little stability the family had. With no savings and no safety net, childhood ended abruptly. School stopped after the 5th grade, and work became a necessity rather than a choice. From shining shoes on street corners to singing for coins, Burns learned early that survival depended on performance, adaptability, and toughness. These early experiences left a permanent imprint. Burns did not grow up with a romantic notion of family as an unbreakable institution. Instead, he learned that people disappeared, circumstances shifted overnight, and security had to be built by one's own hands. Hunger, humiliation, and rejection became part of his training rather than obstacles to be avoided. When promoters cheated him, partners abandoned him, or audiences booed him off stage, he absorbed the lesson and moved on. Failure was not tragic to Burns. Stagnation was. As a teenager and young man, Burns reinvented himself repeatedly. He changed names, styles, and acts with remarkable ease, understanding instinctively that identity could be a tool rather than a fixed truth. This habit of reinvention was not merely theatrical. It was psychological. Burns learned to detach emotion from necessity. If something did not work, it was replaced. If someone could not keep pace, they were left behind. This mindset would later define his approach to business, relationships, and money. Long before he became wealthy, Burns developed a disciplined, almost austere relationship with finances. While many entertainers spent freely during good years, he quietly invested, particularly in real estate during the Great Depression. Having seen poverty firsthand, he feared dependence more than risk. Money, to him, was not a symbol of status or indulgence, but a shield against vulnerability. It was meant to secure independence, not to guarantee comfort for others by default. This worldview made Burns fundamentally different from the sentimental image often projected onto him in old age. His humor was warm, but his thinking was precise. He valued loyalty, competence, and shared values over formal roles like blood relation or title. These principles, formed in childhood hardship and reinforced through decades of survival and entertainment, would later resurface with startling clarity when he made decisions about legacy, inheritance, and what it truly meant to leave something behind. If George Burns's childhood forged his instinct for survival, his partnership with Gracie Allen gave that instinct a singular emotional focus. Their relationship was not merely a marriage or a professional collaboration. It was the axis around which Burns's inner world revolved. To understand Burns as a man, one must understand that, for him, Gracie was not one important relationship among many. She was a relationship. Everything else existed in orbit. When Burns met Gracie Allen in the early 1920s, he initially assumed the traditional comedic hierarchy. He would be the witty center, and she would play the straight counterpart. The audience overturned that assumption instantly. Gracie's seemingly illogical responses, delivered with absolute sincerity, drew laughter more powerfully than anything Burns had done before. Crucially, Burns recognized this not as a threat, but as a revelation. He adapted the act overnight, repositioning himself as a calm observer whose role was to frame Gracie's brilliance. That decision revealed something essential about his character. Burns was ambitious, but he was not fragile. He did not need to dominate in order to feel secure. This dynamic extended far beyond the stage. Burns consistently credited Gracie as the creative force behind their success, even though he often wrote the material and structured the performances. In an era when male performers routinely absorbed all recognition, Burns made a deliberate choice to elevate his partner publicly. This was not a gesture of politeness. It was an acknowledgement of truth as he saw it. Gracie was the irreplaceable element. Without her, the act would collapse. Burns never pretended otherwise. Their marriage in 1926 fused personal and professional life into a single, inseparable unit. Contracts soon followed that required them to perform together exclusively, binding their careers legally as well as emotionally. For decades, they moved through vaudeville, radio, film, and television as a single entity. Audiences experienced them as a unit, and Burns himself internalized that identity. He did not imagine a version of success that did not include Gracie at its center. What makes this bond especially relevant to Burns's later decisions is the depth of sacrifice it involved. Gracie lived with chronic health problems, including a heart condition that worsened over time. She continued performing despite pain, exhaustion, and recurring illness, often shielding the audience from any sign of weakness. Burns, fully aware of her fragility, structured their work to protect her as much as possible. When she could no longer continue, he accepted the end of their shared era without protest, even though it meant losing the defining force of his career. Gracie's death in 1964 marked a permanent emotional rupture. Burns did not remarry, nor did he seek to reconstruct the kind of intimate partnership he had lost. Instead, he carried her presence forward symbolically. On stage, he spoke to an empty chair as if she were still there. In interviews, he referred to her in the present tense. His later achievements, including his remarkable resurgence in the 70s and 80s, were framed not as reinvention, but as endurance. He was continuing, not replacing. This singular devotion shaped Burns's understanding of family in a fundamental way. Emotional legitimacy in his mind did not arise from formal roles, such as parent or spouse alone. It arose from shared struggle, mutual contribution, and unwavering alignment of values. Gracie met those criteria absolutely. Others, by implication, did not automatically qualify. Burns's relationship with his adopted children existed, but it never occupied the same moral or emotional space. The video alludes to a betrayal, but it is important to interpret this term through Burns's value system. Betrayal did not necessarily mean cruelty or scandal. It could mean disappointment. It could mean divergence. If Burns believed that his children did not embody the discipline, self-reliance, or respect for work that defined his own life, that gap would matter deeply to him. Silence, distance, or entitlement could weigh more heavily than overt conflict. By the time Burns reached extreme old age, his emotional ledger was already settled. The person to whom he owed everything had been gone for decades. His sense of obligation was no longer anchored to lineage, but to meaning. Gracie had given him purpose, identity, and a lifetime of shared creation. When she was gone, what remained was principle. And it was those principles, forged in hardship and refined through one extraordinary partnership, that quietly prepared the ground for the final, controversial choice he would make about legacy, loyalty, and the true recipients of his life's work. By the time George Burns reached the final decades of his life, the foundations of his worldview were firmly set. Childhood poverty had taught him self-reliance. Decades in entertainment had taught him discipline, calculation, and emotional control. His marriage to Gracie Allen had taught him what true partnership meant, and her death had clarified, with brutal finality, where his deepest loyalties ended. What remained was a man in possession of extraordinary longevity, wealth, and clarity. It was from this position that Burns confronted the question most people avoid until it is too late. What exactly does one or the others at the end of life? Public reaction to Burns's estate decision often framed it as an act of rejection. Headlines emphasized shock, abandonment, and mystery. His adopted children, Sandra and Ronnie, were reportedly stunned to discover they had been written out of the will entirely. To the outside world, this seemed to violate an unspoken social contract. Parents, especially wealthy ones, are expected to pass their assets to their children. Inheritance is treated as both tradition and moral obligation. Burns, however, had never been a man who lived comfortably inside inherited rules. For Burns, money was never an emotional substitute. It was not a proxy for love, forgiveness, or reconciliation. His relationship with wealth was intensely practical. He earned it through decades of work and preserved it through foresight and restraint. He invested while others spent, saved while others celebrated, and planned while others assumed tomorrow would resemble today. Because money represented independence rather than affection, he did not view inheritance as a sentimental duty. To him, leaving money behind required justification beyond biology or legality. It is critical to understand that Burns did not see himself as punishing his children. From his perspective, he was making a statement about responsibility and meaning. He believed deeply that adults should stand on their own. This belief was not theoretical. He had lived it from the age of 8. Having survived hunger, homelessness, and humiliation without a safety net, Burns regarded self-sufficiency as a moral achievement. If he perceived that his children expected financial reward without embodying that same ethic, the dissonance would have mattered profoundly. The idea of betrayal, often invoked in discussions of his decision, must be interpreted through this lens. Betrayal did not require dramatic conflict. It could take the quieter form of misalignment. Burns valued discipline, humility before work, and respect for effort. If his children's lives, choices, or attitudes clashed with those principles, that alone could register as betrayal in his internal calculus. Silence, distance, or entitlement may have weighed heavier than argument ever could. As Burns aged, his sense of time sharpened. He had outlived nearly everyone he had grown up with, worked with, or loved. Fame no longer impressed him. Praise no longer flattered him. What mattered instead was coherence. He wanted the final chapter of his life to align with the values that had carried him across a century. Charity, for Burns, offered that alignment. It allowed his money to serve a purpose beyond comfort. It transformed wealth from possession into action. The organizations he chose were not random. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center had treated him and countless others. The Motion Picture and Television Fund supported members of the industry who, unlike Burns, had not always been lucky or disciplined enough to prepare for hardship. The United Jewish Fund connected his legacy to cultural and communal roots that had shaped his earliest identity. Each recipient reflected a part of his life story. These were institutions that represented survival, community, and continuity rather than bloodline. Burns's decision can also be understood as a final assertion of autonomy. Throughout his career, he resisted being defined by expectation. He had defied convention by stepping back to let Gracie shine. He had defied age by becoming a major film star in his 80s. He had defied health warnings by continuing to perform long after most people would have retired into silence. Writing his children out of his will was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of control. It allowed him, even in death, to remain the author of his own narrative. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable truth embedded in this choice. Burns did not believe that money repaired emotional distance. If relationships had frayed, he did not attempt to stitch them together with inheritance. In his mind, that would have been dishonest. Burns preferred clarity over consolation. He was willing to be misunderstood if it meant remaining faithful to his principles. That willingness to accept misunderstanding is a recurring trait in people who live exceptionally long lives. With time, social approval loses its power. Critically, Burns did not make this decision impulsively. He was methodical, reflective, and aware of the reaction it would provoke. He had lived long enough to know how stories form around famous lives. He understood that people would speculate, accuse, and dramatize. Yet he chose silence over explanation. This, too, was consistent with his character. Burns believed action spoke louder than justifications. If people could not understand his decision, that was not a problem he felt compelled to solve. In the end, Burns's will was not merely a legal document. It was a philosophical statement. It declared that legacy is not synonymous with lineage, that money carries moral weight, and that the final measure of a life is not who inherits it, but what it supports. To some, this will always feel cold. To others, it will feel bracingly honest. But viewed through the full arc of George Burns's life, it was neither shocking nor cruel. It was consistent. Burns lived for 100 years by trusting his judgment over convention. He survived by adapting, endured by planning, and loved by choosing deeply rather than broadly. When faced with the ultimate decision of distribution, He did what he had always done. He asked not who was entitled, but what made sense. And in that choice, he left behind not just a fortune, but a final, unmistakable expression of who he had always been. In the final assessment of George Burns, the controversy surrounding his estate is less revealing than the assumptions it exposes about inheritance, family, and moral obligation. Much of the public reaction to his decision rested on an unexamined premise: that wealth naturally belongs to descendants, and that failing to pass it on constitutes a moral failure. Burns's life, however, consistently challenged such inherited assumptions. His will did not break character. It completed it. Burns lived long enough to watch multiple generations confuse comfort with entitlement. From his perspective, modern expectations around inheritance risked undermining the very qualities that had enabled his survival. He believed that struggle, not security, formed character. His own life offered constant evidence. Had money been handed to him early, he often suggested, he might never have developed the discipline, observational skill, and emotional resilience that made him exceptional. To pass on wealth without requiring similar growth would, in his mind, be an act of indulgence rather than love. This outlook places Burns firmly within a tradition of hard individualism that shaped much of early 20th century American culture. For immigrants like his parents, survival depended on effort, adaptation, and sacrifice. There are no guarantees. Burns absorbed this lesson so completely that he never abandoned it, even after achieving extraordinary success. Wealth did not soften his worldview. If anything, it sharpened it. The more he accumulated, the more seriously he treated the question of deserving. Importantly, Burns did not reject the idea of giving. He rejected the idea of automatic giving. Charity, for him, was not a sentimental gesture, but a deliberate investment. He wanted his money to function after his death in the same way it had during his life, as a tool. Tools, by definition, must be used properly. When he looked at institutions like hospitals, industry funds, and communal organizations, he saw structures that transform money into concrete outcomes. When he looked at inheritance based solely on family connection, he saw uncertainty. The difference mattered. Burns's silence on the matter also deserves attention. He never offered a public justification for excluding his children. He did not frame himself as a wrong father or a betrayed patriarch. This restraint was consistent with his broader approach to conflict. Burns rarely explained himself when he felt explanation would weaken clarity. He trusted that those who truly understood him would recognize the logic, and those who did not were not his intended audience. There is a tendency to psychoanalyze the silence as emotional coldness. A more accurate interpretation is that Burns did not believe emotional narratives belonged in financial decisions. He separated feeling from structure. This separation allowed him to maintain internal coherence even when choices were painful. In a culture increasingly driven by public confession and moral performance, Burns's refusal to dramatize his motives feels stark. Yet that starkness is precisely what made his decision durable. Burns's choice also forces a reconsideration of what legacy actually means. Legacy is often imagined as continuity of bloodline or name. Burns, who had reinvented himself repeatedly, was never particularly invested in names as fixed markers. He had changed his own. Instead, he understood legacy as influence. His influence lived in comedy, in timing, in the straight man archetype that shaped generations of performers. It lived in institutions that would continue to support artists, patients, and communities long after his death. These outcomes mattered more to him than personal remembrance. From this perspective, the exclusion of his children was not an erasure, but a boundary. Burns drew a clear line between personal affection and structural responsibility. He may have loved his children in ways that were private and imperfect, but he did not believe love required financial perpetuation. In fact, he may have believed the opposite, that withholding inheritance preserved their autonomy rather than undermining it. To be forced to rely on one's own abilities, as he had, was not a curse in his moral framework. It was a gift. Critics often argue that Burns underestimated the emotional impact of his choice. That may be true. Longevity can distance a person from contemporary emotional norms. Having lived through poverty, war, and mass social upheaval, Burns likely regarded disappointment as survivable. He had endured worse. What appears harsh from a modern standpoint may have seemed measured from his vantage point. Age did not make him cruel, but it did recalibrate his scale of suffering. There is also the question of fairness. Burns never claimed to be fair in a universal sense. He claimed to be consistent. Fairness, as commonly defined, relies on shared expectations. Burns operated on personal standards. Those standards were applied relentlessly to himself first. He worked until physical decline made it impossible. He maintained discipline over indulgence. He faced regret without rewriting history to excuse it. When he finally stopped performing, it was not by choice but by bodily limitation. In such a life, consistency carries moral weight of its own. Ultimately, Burns's estate decision confronts the audience with an uncomfortable truth. Wealth is not neutral. It expresses values whether we intend it to or not. By directing his fortune toward institutions rather than individuals, Burns made his values explicit. He prioritized service over sentiment, structure over lineage, and impact over comfort. Whether one agrees with that hierarchy is secondary. What matters is that it was not accidental. George Burns did not leave behind a puzzle meant to be solved by speculation. He left behind a statement meant to be recognized. His will was not a rejection of family, but a reaffirmation of principle. In a life defined by deliberate choices, this final act stands not as an anomaly, but as a closing line of a century-long argument about independence, meaning, and the disciplined use of what one earns. In reflecting on the life and final decisions of George Burns, it becomes clear that his legacy cannot be reduced to a controversy over inheritance. That moment at the end of his life was not the story itself, but the final articulation of philosophy refined over 100 years. Burns did not drift into old age confused or softened by sentimentality. He arrived there sharpened by memory, disciplined by habit, and guided by an internal logic that had rarely failed him. Burns's extraordinary longevity granted him a perspective that few people ever attain. He witnessed America transform from an immigrant society struggling with industrial poverty into a media-saturated culture obsessed with youth comfort and visibility. He saw entertainment evolve from vaudeville stages to radio studios, from black and white television to modern cinema. Through all of this, he remained acutely aware of how easily success distorted values. Fame could create illusions. Money could weaken resolve. Applause could substitute for a purpose. Burns refused to allow these forces to define him. One of the most striking aspects of Burns's later years was his insistence on usefulness. Even after Gracie Allen's death, even after his physical health began to decline, he continued to work not merely to remain visible, but to remain relevant. His late career success in films such as The Sunshine Boys and Oh God was not a nostalgic victory lap. It was evidence that he still believed contribution mattered. Retirement, in his mind, was not a reward. It was a surrender. This belief shaped his understanding of legacy just as powerfully as his childhood poverty had. Burns's fortune, accumulated slowly and preserved carefully, symbolized effort converted into security. But security, for Burns, was always personal, never transferable by default. He had earned his independence through discipline and foresight, and he did not believe that independence could be inherited. To give money without requiring effort would have violated his deepest convictions about human development. From his perspective, struggle was not cruelty. It was preparation. This outlook places Burns at odds with modern narratives that equate provision with care. In contemporary culture, financial support is often treated as proof of love or responsibility. Burns rejected this equivalence. He separated emotional bonds from material transfer. This separation allowed him to maintain clarity even when decisions risked misunderstanding. He was willing to be judged harshly if judgment was the price of coherence. It is also important to note that Burns did not frame his final decision as a moral lesson for others. He did not campaign against inheritance or publicly criticize those who chose differently. His philosophy was intensely personal. He applied it to himself and expected no universal adoption. This restraint is significant. Burns understood the danger of turning private values into public doctrine. He acted quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. The institutions Burns supported with his estate reveal what he ultimately cared about preserving: Hospitals represented dignity and vulnerability. Industry funds represented solidarity among workers who lacked the foresight or opportunity he had possessed. Cultural and communal organizations represented continuity beyond individual lives. These choices indicate that Burns' sense of responsibility expanded outward as his personal circle contracted. As family ties loosened, communal ties strengthened. This was not abandonment. It was reorientation. From a broader ethical perspective, Burns' decision invites a reassessment of what responsibility looks like at the end of life. Is responsibility defined by maintaining lineage or by maximizing impact? Is love proven by protection from hardship or by confidence in another's capacity to endure it? Burns answered these questions in ways that challenged comforting assumptions. He trusted that adults, including his own children, could survive disappointment. He trusted institutions more than individuals to convert wealth into sustained good. These were not popular answers, but they were honest ones. Burns' life also demonstrates the psychological effects of extreme longevity. Living to 100 reshapes one's relationship to time, approval, and consequence. Social judgment loses urgency. The need to explain diminishes. What remains is alignment with self. Burns did not seek reconciliation through inheritance because reconciliation, if it were to exist, would have had to occur in life, not through a will. Money, in his view, was incapable of repairing emotional distance after death. In this sense, his final act was also an assertion of boundaries. Burns refused to let death transform his wealth into a substitute for unresolved relationships. He did not want his legacy interpreted as apology or compensation. He wanted it to function. This functional view of morality is consistent with his career. Comedy, for Burns, was not about confession or catharsis. It was about structure, timing, and effect. His ethics followed the same pattern. What remains after Burns' death is not merely a set of anecdotes or a ledger of assets, but a coherent model of personal responsibility. He demonstrated that values need not soften with age, that generosity does not require sentimentality, and that clarity can coexist with compassion. His choices were not designed to comfort observers. They were designed to make sense to him. Ultimately, George Burns left behind more than money or controversy. He left behind an argument about independence, effort, and the disciplined use of success. His life suggests that meaning is not inherited, but built, tested, and reaffirmed through action. By directing his fortune toward institutions rather than individuals, Burns made one final statement: that a life's work should continue to work after the life itself has ended. Whether admired or criticized, that statement remains unmistakably his. In the years following George Burns' death, the public conversation around his will gradually shifted from shock to reflection. Initial headlines focused on the drama of exclusion, but over time, a quieter question emerged. What does Burns' decision reveal about the nature of success, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of the values a person lives by? Seen from this distance, his final choice functions less as a personal controversy and more as a case study in value-driven decision-making. Burns' life demonstrates that values, when consistently applied over decades, inevitably shape outcomes that may surprise those who only observe the end result. His insistence on self-reliance, discipline, and usefulness did not suddenly appear in old age. These principles govern his career choices, his financial behavior, and his personal relationships long before questions of inheritance arose. The will simply made visible what had long been true. In this sense, the controversy was not caused by the decision itself, but by a mismatch between Burns' internal logic and society's expectations. One of the most enduring lessons from Burns' story is the distinction between obligation and choice. Modern culture often frames family obligation as unconditional and non-negotiable. Burns rejected this framing. He treated obligation as something earned through alignment of values rather than granted by role. This does not mean he dismissed family altogether, but it does mean he refused to allow family status alone to override his judgment. For Burns, choice retained more priority even at the end of life. This perspective can feel unsettling because it challenges comforting assumptions. Many people rely on inheritance as a symbol of continuity and belonging. Burns's example suggests that continuity can take other forms. Influence, institutional support, and cultural contribution can extend a life's impact more reliably than wealth transferred within a single household. Burns chose durability over intimacy, not because intimacy lacked value, but because durability aligned better with his sense of purpose. It is also important to recognize the role of time in shaping Burns's worldview. Living through multiple economic collapses, wars, and cultural shifts gave him a deep awareness of fragility. He had seen fortunes disappear overnight and reputations vanish just as quickly. Institutions, imperfect as they are, offered him a form of stability that individuals often could not. This likely reinforces trust in structured giving rather than personal bequests. Burns's decision also underscores the limits of posthumous judgment. Without direct explanation, observers are left to interpret motives through fragments of biography and rumor. Burns appeared comfortable with this ambiguity. He had spent a career allowing audiences to project meaning onto his work. Silence, for him, was not avoidance but acceptance. He understood that no explanation could satisfy every expectation, and he did not attempt to reconcile them. From an ethical standpoint, Burns's story complicates simplistic narratives about generosity. Generosity is often measured by proximity. Giving to those closest is assumed to be more virtuous than giving outward. Burns inverted this hierarchy. He believed generosity required intention, not intimacy. By directing his wealth toward causes that would continue functioning long after his death, he expressed generosity as foresight rather than affection. For future generations, Burns's life offers a cautionary insight. Values are not abstract ideals. They are operational systems. When applied consistently, they produce outcomes that may be uncomfortable but coherent. Burns did not make an exception for death. He extended the same principles that govern his life into its final administrative act. That consistency, whether admired or criticized, is the core of his legacy. In the end, George Burns leaves behind a paradox. He was a man known for warmth, humor, and apparent ease, yet his deepest convictions were exacting and unsentimental. He made people laugh for generations, but he did not confuse laughter with leniency. His final decision reminds us that kindness and clarity are not the same thing, and that a life lived deliberately will often conclude deliberately as well. Burns did not ask to be agreed with. He asked implicitly to be understood on his own terms. Whether one accepts those terms is a personal choice. What cannot be denied is that his life and his final act form a continuous line. From a boy shining shoes on New York streets to a centenarian shaping his legacy, George Burns remained faithful to a single idea. That meaning comes not from what one is given, but from what one chooses to do with what one earns. When viewed as a complete arc, the life of George Burns resists sentimental closure. There is no neat moral resolution, no universally comforting lesson. Instead, there is coherence. Burns lived according to a set of principles formed early, tested repeatedly, and upheld without exception. His final decision regarding his estate was not a rupture with those principles, but their last and clearest expression. Burns understood that a life is not judged only by affection or intention, but by structure. Structure determines how effort is converted into outcome, how values are translated into action, and how responsibility is exercised when personal presence is no longer possible. For Burns, the ultimate responsibility was not to soothe feelings after death, but to ensure that what he left behind continued to function meaningfully. He treated legacy as an extension of work, not as a ceremonial handoff. This perspective places Burns outside the emotional economy that often surrounds inheritance. He did not view wealth as a symbol of parental success or emotional completion. He viewed it as accumulated energy. Energy, once released, should move toward purpose. In his judgment, institutions designed to heal, support, and sustain others offered a clearer purpose than private inheritance. This choice was not motivated by distance alone, but by direction. Burns's story challenges the assumption that longevity softens conviction. In his case, time refined it. As social norms shifted toward comfort and reassurance, he remained anchored to effort and consequence. He had seen too much collapse to believe in guarantees, and too much survival to believe in despair. His humor made life bearable, but his discipline made it possible. That distinction mattered deeply to him. There is an important restraint in how Burns allowed his story to end. He did not attempt to shape his posthumous image through explanation or apology. He left silence where many would leave justification. That silence was not indifference. It was confidence. Burns trusted that his life, taken as a whole, spoke clearly enough. He accepted that some would misunderstand him, just as some audiences had misunderstood his timing early in his career. Misunderstanding to Burns was survivable. Ultimately, Burns leaves behind a legacy that asks more questions than it answers. What do we owe others by default, and what do we owe by choice? Is generosity defined by proximity or by impact? Does love require protection from hardship, or faith in another's capacity to endure it? Burns answered these questions in a way that reflected his own life, not society's preferences. In the end, George Burns did not try to be exemplary. He tried to be consistent. His life suggests that consistency, carried across decades, becomes its own form of integrity. Whether one agrees with his final choice or not, it is impossible to deny that it belonged fully to him. And in that sense, his last act was no different from the thousands of performances that came before it. Precisely timed, deliberately structured, and faithful to the voice that had guided him for a century.